Professor Dodson, why is there no mentioning of Indigenous Australians in the Australian Constitution?
I think when they drafted it in 1901, they had a view that Aborigines were going to die out because we were deemed to be an inferior race. They were more concerned about people of colour, the Chinese and Indians and Pacific Island people. And the references to Indigenous peoples were basically being excluded from counting in the populations, so as to ensure that where larger populations of Indigenous peoples were in the states, that the economic sharing between the nation states would be more equitable for the smaller population places. The Constitution is embedded in this racist thinking that about prohibition. The first act of our Parliament in 1901 was the Immigration Act, of course, which was underpinned by the White Australia policy. So the thinking was very much about people of colour and excluding them, managing them, or ensuring that they weren't going to change the texture of the British cultural and political aspirations.
Will the inclusion of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, if it goes ahead, will it change anything practically, or will it just be a nice sentiment?
Well, it'll be a head of power, and in that sense it's there to be used or not used by a government. And the way in which a government might want to use it will depend on its ideology and its policies and its respect for the Indigenous peoples. Unless there's some kind of preambular statement that sets out how Indigenous peoples ought to be, how the power ought to be used when it's exercised, very little will change. And again, it'll depend on the politics.
What is necessary to finally make a change?
Well, the Australian Constitution is a hard thing to change, but there are other avenues open to us. We could proceed by way of treaty. We could work out a settlement process, set up a tribunal or a commission to actually deal with all the various matters that are of concern to Indigenous peoples, and try and find an accommodation to that. Similar to Native American societies, recognition of some governance, what domain, looking at some resource arrangements, and support for social and cultural programs. So you could do that if you didn't want to entrench settlements. It could be done by way of politics and by agreement. So that's relatively simple in that sense. But if it's to settle the concept of how Australia became to be settled, that's a different issue. That's going to require a lot more argument and thinking through, I think.
Is there a chance or majority of Australians who would support a sort of a treaty?
It's hard to tell. I would think Australians are at the stage where they would like to see something done. They're not really clear what it ought to be. They think an amendment to the Constitution that it talks about it as being a recognition of Aboriginal peoples is a good thing, but I don't think they fully understand that the recognition is really a head of power. It's not giving to Aborigines any rights. It's not setting up a Bill of Rights. I think they would be happy, if we did set up a constructive way to find settlement to the ongoing issues of public policy deficits, of these long overdue considerations of compensation, and enable Indigenous communities to manage and control their own affairs. Not in isolation of the mainstream society, but on a basis where they can be respected and interface with with the mainstream. There's too many people incarcerated, there's too many kids being detained, the social policies are based on a deficit model of the Aboriginal people. Most Australians are becoming embarrassed by the way we are actually executing our public policy and would like to see us find a better way to do this.
You've been fighting for various social issues, for Aboriginal land rights, for Aboriginal rights as a whole, for a very, very long time. Do you get frustrated? Do you think it will never change, or do you have hope for the future?
I think you have to have hope. It's roughly 45 years since the first Prime Minister, I think, started talking about a treaty, for instance. Well, we don't have a treaty. Bob Hawke at Barunga spoke about a treaty many years ago, and we still haven't advanced that. John Howard, when he was Prime Minister, spoke about some recognition in a preamble. That still hasn't been achieved. We've had different Prime Ministers over the period speak about wanting to do something. Nothing concrete has happened in terms of the Constitution or settlement. We now have a new Prime Minister talking about wanting to do something. We're not sure what, but he has to engage in the dialogue with the Indigenous leaders, I would hope, to come to an accommodation about how we can progress this matter and find some settlement.
What, in your opinion, is the way out now to improve the situation of Indigenous people now?
I think you've got to set up go back to something that we had, like regional authorities, where Indigenous peoples are empowered. You've got to have some sort of leveraging fund to enable them to set priorities around the things that they would like to see done in their communities, but also have a capacity to influence whatever the public policy service deliverers are meant to be doing, so they can interface with those people on a fair and just basis, but have some funds of their own to leverage programs that they see as important. As a start, the model we have now is one where public servants basically dictate what it is the Indigenous peoples can do. The social policies are driven by billionaires who have no idea about poverty and the dignity of poor people and how they ought to be treated. So we've got to change that paradigm, and the only way to change that is give power back to the people at the regions and the local level.
Last question. How do you feel about all this after fighting for such a long time? Do you feel like giving up? What do you feel like?
Well, I think Australia has potential to be a great nation, and I suppose that's always motivates me. We have got a legacy that's pretty atrocious of how we've interfaced with Indigenous peoples. I think we've got capacity to fix some of that up, restore some of that, but it does take leadership, and that's the leadership out of the non-Indigenous sector, I think. There are differing views within the Indigenous world itself, but mainly they're around how do we come to a settlement in a dignified and honourable, just way. That's really what most Indigenous peoples are about. How do we improve the social circumstances? How do we get respect for our culture and our social value systems? How do we become empowered in the economic arenas in order to remove the interference and domination of government policies, where we can set our own strategic goals and objectives?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.